think, act, and prosper. You are now tuned into the Money Level Show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Money Level Show, where we think, act, and prosper. This channel focuses on changing financial trajectories and building legacies. I am your host, Daryl Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Jim Rogers. Today we're going to hear Jim's story on his grind to greatness. This is part of a series that I started to capture the stories of the legendary people within the investment space and how they rose to the place that they are today. So you're in for a treat. Let's go ahead and listen to the story of Jim Rogers. Hey, Jim, I'm glad to have you back on.
I am delighted to be here, Daryl. Good morning.
Yes, I'm glad to have you part of this series that I'm doing called The Grind to Greatness. And this series is really about how did some of the people in the space that have had tremendous amounts of success or are on the way to success, how did they get to where they are? And this series is to inspire, the average person, and give them encouragement, with their dreams and things of that nature. And so I'm glad to have you on today. So let's start from the beginning. Where are you from and what was your childhood like? I know we've discussed this a little bit before, but this episode is specifically tied to how Jim Rogers got to where he's at.
Well, Daryl, I grew up in a small town in the backwoods of Alabama. My phone number was 5. That's not a typo. That was my phone number. It was far away from any cities or anything. We didn't get exposed much to other things, the outside world, very little. But by chance, I went to a university in the north, which was far away from home, which was a gigantic shock to me because I didn't know anything about the world or them or it or anything. But I certainly couldn't go home. I had to work hard to survive, and I did so. And by chance, a few years later, I discovered investing, Wall Street, and fell in love because I didn't know it at the time, but my passion was knowing the world and what was happening in the world. And so this is where I decided to go instead of other professions.
Really quick, Jim. Really quick. I want to slow it down a little bit. You getting into the good parts, So you were raised in a small town. The phone number was 5, right? What kind of work was your family into? Were you on the farm? Were you in city? What were those dynamics like?
Well, I started working at a very early age because I didn't know any better, and my parents certainly thought we should work. We needed money. I worked in grocery stores. I sold peanuts at baseball games. There was not much you could do in a very small town, but anything I could do, I did. At times, I had 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. I was going to school, obviously, but that's what I did. Went to school, did school activities, and had jobs.
So you were young. You were on your grind, you're working multiple jobs. The family instilled this hard work in you, hey, we all need to work, right? How far did the dollar take you back then?
Oh my gosh, Darryl. One night, when I was, my first job was picking up empty bottles at the baseball games. And the lady paid me 5 cents for every 24 bottles that I picked up. 5 cents for 24. Well, one night I made so much money. It was $1.15. It was more money than I could conceive of. So when I went home, I gave my little brother part of it because I didn't know what to do with that much money. So it was not a lot of money involved. It was a long time ago, and it was the backwoods. One night, there were no fans, and I only made 10 cents. the lady could see I was so sad, she gave me an extra nickel to tide me over. So those were different days.
Hmm. And what could you like spend, your money on like back then? I mean, obviously, I mean, you could get groceries and such, and I mean, I hear these stories even from like, my parents, like, oh, they used to go in the candy store and could, spend 50 cents and get a lot of product for that.
We didn't have candy stores. My area was not so developed. Well, you could go to the picture show. The movie cost 10 cents on Saturday afternoon for a double header. We always went every Saturday afternoon. What else was there to do? We went to watch the cowboy movies. I don't know what else I spent money on. There was not much that I can remember. There was not much to do. I guess it was candy somewhere, but I don't remember eating much candy when I was a kid. I saved, I certainly saved. At one point, we'd saved some money, and so it was my father and took me, and we went and bought with a farmer, a local farmer, and bought some calves, some baby cows for him to raise. There was I now know, I look back, there was a boom going on, but it was the Korean War. I now understand what was happening in the world. My father did not at the time, but cows were booming, so we bought a calf or two. The farmer raised it, and we lost everything, of course, because the Korean War ended and the inflation boom collapsed. And so I don't know what happened to those cows, but I never saw them again, nor the money.
Yeah, yeah, maybe y'all ate them or something. I don't know. So you ended up, obviously in high school and such. And what was that transition to college like? I mean, has any of your family been to college before? Were you the first to go to college? What was that discussion and that decision like?
No, no, both of my parents had been to college, and my grandparents had been to college. So it was expected that their kids would go to college, which when I was in high school, I planned to go to college, and I eventually did. I got a scholarship and went off to college. In over my head, far in over my head. Boy, I'll tell you, there were 40 people in my high school class, and I was, the number one, but most of them couldn't read and write. So being number one wasn't saying very much.
Yeah, yeah, that's that's true. When you got to college, did you have a major in mind, or did you end up changing your major to like some type of finance or something later on? What was kind of like your initial thing you wanted to do?
Well, I had no clue. My father told me to study engineering, which I tried and didn't like, hated it. So I stopped that almost immediately. In the end, I majored in history with the thought that I was going to go to medical school because my mother said I should go to medical school. But it became pretty clear to me quickly that I didn't want to go to medical school. So I dropped that idea. I stumbled on by having a summer job on Wall Street because I liked a guy and he liked me. I didn't know anything about Wall Street. I knew it was in New York. I knew something bad happened in 1929, but I didn't know the difference in stocks and bonds. I thought they were the same thing. But I fell in love pretty quickly because I realized, oh my gosh, I love this. They pay me to know what's happening in the world. So I didn't go to law school or medical school or anything else. I went to Wall Street as soon as I could.
Okay, so this relates to a lot of people. People join, they get into college and they figure that they want to go a certain direction, and then they end up changing it, and then they find out where they want to be later. I mean, and I've seen that story play out a lot, and so when you got to Wall Street, you worked a summer job. What do you feel was like the thing that you gravitated to? Was it like the money? Was it the stocks? Like, or like what do you feel was pulling you towards finance and investing?
Well, it was exciting to be constantly finding out what was happening. And if you got it right, you could make a lot of money if you realized what was happening and going to be happening in the world. And that to me was very, very exciting and a lot of fun. They didn't have to pay me. I would have done it for free. No, 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 I didn't. I couldn't do it for free, but that was just so much fun for me to be finding out everything in the world and what would be happening in the world.
Hmm. And what type of companies were in favor, as we have these cyclicalities with certain stocks, whether it be energy, commodities, value versus growth. Like what stocks were in favor? What was kind of like the hot sectors that people were focused on, if you remember during that time?
Well, I barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. So I don't. But I mean, Xerox was a hot, hot, hot growth company, new growth company at the time. There was nothing like Xerox. So many people were piling into Xerox. IBM. IBM was a new hot industry company area. There were companies like that everybody there, and these are old companies now, but at the time they were hot new industries and hot growth industries.
Hmm. And what do you feel were the most easiest concepts of stocks or trading or whatnot? And what were the most challenging concepts for you during that time?
Well, obviously to find something new that everybody didn't know about. I remember one of the great stories at the time was American Express had been a huge scandal, and somebody had duped American Express and they lost hundreds of millions. So the stock was a disaster, but it obviously, like many disasters, I didn't know it at the time, but it was a great opportunity. American Express company and stock had totally collapsed. Well, somebody figured out this was a great opportunity. American Express is still around, as you know, but it went through gigantic. It was the salad oil scandal in the 60s.
It was
Very
so.
few would remember that now, but it was a huge deal in those days.
And what was the bond market like during that time? I mean, I'm sure you know just from your studies on history, but was it mostly stocks or were bonds? I mean, obviously.
It was mainly stocks. No, very few people paid too much attention to bonds. There was a bond department over there, and nobody paid much attention to them. At the New York Stock Exchange, there was a room that was the bond room. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. That was where the action was. But at the stock exchange, there was a room, literally a room, that was the bond room. Not much happening.
Hmm. Got you. That must have been boring. So back then, I believe during that time, you would get actual physical certificates of stock if you owned a company. Um,
Yes, yes.
I don't even know what that looks like. I mean, that's how much things have changed. It's like I don't even know what a stock certificate looks like. Um, but how did it feel like just being able to own something physical? I mean, because this before you got into like gold, physical gold.
Well, gold was unknown at that time. I mean, gold was still had been this price had been set in the 30s, and that was it. There was I doubt. I mean, there must have been gold trading somewhere, but gold price had been set for decades. So there wasn't a gold market in those days that I knew about anyway. But what was it like physics? I don't know. None of us ever took delivery. The certificates were usually kept by the broker or the bank. Yes, some people took delivery and took the certificates home and put them in their vault or in their closet. I don't know what they did with them. I never took delivery. I didn't have much money. I didn't have to have much, but most people did not take delivery of shares even then.
So in the '60s, there was a I know there was a situation where people were hoarding silver, and the government. I think they had the silver set at a certain price or whatnot, and then eventually it led to the debasement of silver coins. Were you into silver at that time, or did this not come until the 70s?
Well, I knew about it. Silver was $1.29, $1.29 per ounce, and gold was $35 per ounce, which had been set by the governments years before. But there were people starting to talk, not many, but starting to talk about, well, the price of silver is going to have to go up, so you should buy silver, whether it was coins or the real stuff or the stocks. I did not. I mean, first of all, I didn't have any money. Second, I didn't have any brains. But I do remember people talking about you should buy silver. It's going to have to go up, and gold as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it was interesting reading about that, and then because I was wondering, like, okay, what was so significant about the 1964 date, and it seems like the hoarding of silver, because silver wasn't outlawed, to where they had confiscation on, and so and the governments needed the metal, and so it was pretty interesting. So.
Well, silver has always been a useful industrial metal. There's been a use for silver besides just jewelry. And I guess some smart people figured this out in the 60s. Not me, but there were people who realized, oh my gosh, silver is turning into a shortage and the price will have to go up.
Mhm. Gotcha. So now getting to the decade of the 70s, um, how confident do you feel you were during that time in your career and things of that nature?
Well, by then I had more experience and I was older and knew more about the world. And so I was getting better at it and I loved it. It was my passion. So I was constantly on the lookout for things to invest in all over the world, not just stocks, currencies, commodities, bonds, anything, selling short. I learned to sell short. I'll tell you a story. Once in the early 70s, I was at a party and, young kids are always talking about, well, what do you do? What do you do? I said, well, I work on Wall Street. And the woman said, oh my God, things must be terrible for you because there was a bear market at that time. And I said, no, I'm short. And she looked at me like, well, you goddamn fool, I can see you're short. What does that have to do with anything? People didn't even know what selling short was in those days. But I learned and I loved it.
Hmm. And during those days, I mean, obviously we had there was the Watergate scandal. I mean, you had Nixon and Ford and Jimmy Carter, inflation, interest rates. Uh, what was that like for you navigating that, and how did you, like? I mean, I don't know, if your family was still around at that time, but I'm sure people came to you for guidance during that time.
Well, my family was still back in that small town in the backwoods of Alabama. And it was long distance phone calls were expensive in those days. So there wasn't not many people were asking me for advice anywhere because if you don't remember, but the 70s, Wall Street was still not a major center. It was still pretty much a backwater for most people. Most people, if they wanted to get successful, they went to medical school or law school or something. A few started going to business school in those days, but Wall Street was not the center that it became. I was having fun, so I didn't know or care that it wasn't a major center. I was having fun finding investments.
And do you think some of this sentiment was just carried over from the decades of after the 1929 crash, or
No, definitely. The 30s, nobody wanted to go to Wall Street during the Depression and after. It was a backwater. If people went to business school, and few went to business school, they wound up going to work for General Motors or some major manufacturer. Very few went to Wall Street in those days. I remember when I was in college, I was saying to one of my professors, I was talking about the stock market. He said, why do you care? It's a backwater. It's not important. And he was right. Fortunately, I didn't know that and didn't care.
yeah, and I imagine was this was probably before the time of 401ks and people's uh, retirement plans being tied with the market.
Well, oh yes, I don't remember the exact, it was the Senator Keogh, as I remember. It were the Keogh plans, but they started probably in the 70s. We could look it up, but probably in the 70s.
Okay. And I mean, during this time, I mean, obviously there was a lot of so you stayed focused on, you know, your job, doing it well. There was a lot of political tension. I mean, you still had the, you know, the issues with Vietnam. You know, I think it came to an end around that time. I mean, you had a lot of populism, inflation. You know, interest rates were risen multiple times during that decade. Um, like, what would you say the sentiment of those around you were? Like, do you feel like you were able to breeze through it unaffected, or do you feel like you felt the bite of things that were happening?
Well, for whatever reason, our performance in the 70s was very good, but the 70s was a decade of malaise, or whatever you want to call it, because of the war, because of inflation, the Vietnamese War, because of inflation. There were many problems in the world economy and in the world period in those days, but somehow or another we did well. Partly because we loved it so much, I guess.
Hmm. Okay. And then in the 70s, were you involved in the commodities? I mean, when gold was taken off the gold standard, we saw a gold bull market. We saw oil, the oil embargo. I forgot to even mention that. I think the SPR was created in the 70s as well. Were you involved in commodities at that point?
The SDR was actually developed in the 60s. It became much bigger in the 70s. No, we had certainly invested in oil, gold. We've invested in all sorts of things in those days. We were looking for any way to make an honest living.
Hmm. Gotcha, gotcha. So then transitioning to the 80s, right? It seems like from documentaries I've watched, I mean, obviously, you know, Paul Volcker and Reagan were in office and at the Fed. Interest rates goes really high. There's probably the start of a new, like a bond bull market and such. I mean, you had the crash in 1987. How do you feel you navigated that decade in your career?
Well, I stopped working in 1980 because being from the backwoods of Alabama, I wanted to see the world. So I stopped working. I'd made a little money and said, I'm going to go around the world on my motorcycle. That had been since I was a teenager. I wanted to do that. Shows I didn't have many horizons. So I stopped working and set out to try to go around the world on my motorcycle in the 80s. I did so eventually, but I wanted adventure more than money at that point because I'd had a little, I had a little money, more money than I ever dreamed of. It wasn't much, but a lot for me. So I wanted to see the world. So I set up trying to get permission to go around the world. But those were the days of Red China and the Soviet Union. It was impossible. It was some crazy American who wanted to go around the world on a motorcycle. I started trying. I eventually got permission and I eventually did it, but it took several years.
Hmm. What route did you take? I mean, like you got on a motorcycle. What state were you in, and did you go up to Canada
Uh,
first, or how did you how did
No,
you?
I started in Iceland and then drove across Europe and across China, across so Siberia, across Russia. I went from Ireland to Japan, and then from Japan back across Siberia and the Soviet Union to Ireland again, down to the bottom of Africa, went down through the middle of Africa, Australia, New Zealand, South America, up to Alaska, back to New York. Quite happy.
Wow, yeah, that sound like quite the experience. Um,
It was at the time. I look back on it and I'm amazed. I don't know how I did it. It couldn't have been done, but if I did it, I didn't know any better. I didn't know it couldn't be done, so I succeeded.
what do you feel is the most memorable memory from that trip?
I guess making it home alive was probably the most memorable. Well, I do remember at one point we were held hostage in Africa for a week or two, held hostage by the police chief, by the way. No, very friendly. He took us home to dinner, took us to the nightclubs, etc. But he wouldn't let us leave. Finally, we convinced him we didn't have any more money, and he let us go. He put us on a flat car, took us down to the railroad yard, put us on a flat car, and told them not to let us off until we got to a city far away. That was a memorable experience. I mean, everything for me was new. You have to remember, Daryl, I didn't know anything. Most people had not seen much of the world in those days. If you had traveled, you had been to Rome, you'd been to Paris, but most people didn't know much. I mean, Japan was an unknown. People barely even knew it was there, except for the. I mean, everybody remembered the war, but nobody traveled to Asia in those days. If you traveled, you went to Paris and Rome and London and places like that.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think during that time, like how are your eyes being opened in terms of economies or markets to look at investing in? Like what do you feel like, how did that change for you?
Well, it was all a shock. Remember, I had been on Wall Street, and the investing world basically was New York. Some who were venturesome invested maybe in London, maybe in Tokyo, but essentially New York. And when I say New York, it was the New York Stock Exchange. The over-the-counter market was developing. NASDAQ had barely existed. It was known as the OTC market, over-the-counter market. That basically is what investing was in the U.S. in those days. But as I traveled, I could see things were happening. I could see that China was changing dramatically. I could see these things. If you're close to the ground, you don't have any choice but to see that things are happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And during that decade, were you at all like in taking less risk, like investing in bonds or just keeping money in savings, getting high interest on your money? Like, what do you feel you were doing with your money at that time, or were you just like out of the game?
Well, I've never liked taking risk, and I didn't think I was taking risk. Of course, people around me thought I was, wow, risk, a crazy person. Because, if I'd invest in something like Germany, they'd say, oh my gosh, that's risky, that's scary. There wasn't much of a German stock market in those days, as a matter of fact. So anything that was new, which was outside the New York Stock Exchange, was considered risky. I didn't think it was risky because I didn't like taking risk. I didn't want to invest in things where I thought I was taking a risk. I thought I was knowing what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So 1987. Were you in the markets at that time? Were you back into the markets at that time, or were you still out of the game?
Well, I mean, you called up one of my triumphs, and I'm delighted. I was on record in the press a fair amount saying that the American stock market is going to collapse. It's a disaster. And my God, it did. One day, in October 1987, the whole thing collapsed. And Daryl, it happened on October 19th, which was also my birthday. So what a birthday present. Here was the worst collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in history. It was on my birthday. And I'd been yattering about it for days, weeks. Yeah, I mean, I was on television, a lot of places, because people kept saying, "You see that nut over there? He's the one who said it was going to collapse," and it did. So that was occasionally I get it right.
Mm-hmm. And at this time, were you writing any of your books then? I mean, you wrote Investment Biker. Were you writing? Were you, writing any books or thinking about that at that point?
No, books were not on my mind at all. Investment Biker was my first book, and that was sort of an accident, like many things in life. I came home from going around the world on my motorcycle, and that very night I was at a dinner and happened to be sitting near the editor of Fortune magazine. He said, "Oh, Jim, I haven't seen you in a while. Where you been?" I said, "I just came back today from going around the world on a motorcycle." He said, we talked a little bit, and he said, "I want the story." So he did a story, his magazine did a story about this nut going around the world on his motorcycle and investing, etc. And that apparently was an interesting story, and that led to the first book. But there was never a plan to do a book, it just happened.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Getting to the 90s, um, I was a baby then, toddler.
Me too.
So I was, so during that decade, I mean, we had I think it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had, I believe it was a recession in the early 90s. I think at that time was it the 90s when China gets into the World Trade Organization? It was somewhere
The end of the 90s.
end of the 90s. And we had a tech boom. Technology was on the rise, and obviously led to a bubble in the 2001 time period. So, what was happening in your life during that decade?
Well, I was back in the US. I was television. I was doing television shows at that time. But my real hope and dream was to go around the world again at the turn of the millennium. The first time I went for 2 years around the world, it was fantastic for me. It was my dream. The woman I was with didn't particularly like it. She made it. She was a great traveler by the end, but she always wanted to go home. I was always talking about going home, and I was never talking about going home. So I wanted to do it again. And I knew that the turn of the millennium was coming. And I knew that nobody had ever been around the world at the turn of the millennium, or if they had, they hadn't put it on the internet. So I was planning and hoping to go around the world at the turn of the millennium, and that was my plan. That's what I was working toward.
Mm-hmm. And were you involved in shorting the markets during the tech bubble?
Oh yeah, I was always involved with the markets. There have been various tech bubbles. Tech bubbles been going on for a long time. At one time, railroads were a tech bubble. Everything, electricity was a tech bubble at one time. Everything is radio. Oh my gosh. Radio Corporation of America is one of the biggest bubbles in the history of the world. The stock collapsed eventually, of course, it's all bubbles too. Radio is still around, but it's not near what it was once upon a time in the stock market. No, we've had some wonderful bubbles throughout history and in all sorts of areas.
Mm-hmm. So, would you say most of your success came from short selling?
No, no, no. Most of my success has been if I've had success from finding things that were ignored and cheap and nobody cared about, where I could see things changing, and then I would invest. And if nobody cared about them, they were usually cheap. And if you could see the change before others, you would probably make some money.
Mm-hmm. What was one of the most hated unknown assets that you saw, invested in, and ended up being a success during that time?
Oh, lots of things. Africa back in those days, Botswana, I invested in Botswana. Most people, including me, could barely find it on a map. That was one area. Japan, a time or two. In the past centuries, a few decades, nearly everything has been hated at one time or another. In the 70s, stocks in the US were hated and ignored, and who cared? The bull market started in 1982, and stocks have been going up a lot for the past 40 years. Bonds, too, were hated when bonds went up for 40 years. Lots of things have been ignored or hated. The Austrian stock market in the 80s. I became known in Austria as the father of the Austrian stock market because I kissed the Sleeping Beauty. That's what they said. Various and sundry things. There are always things that are hated, Darrell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. So the turn of the century or millennium, I guess both. So that first decade, I mean, we had the tech bubble collapse, we had 9/11, we had a bull market in um, energy. I mean, oil, uranium, gold, silver. Then we had the global financial crisis of 2008. That decade seemed pretty chaotic or whatnot. I mean, for me looking back at it, I was in school, and didn't have any awareness of that. So how was that first decade of the 2000s for you, with all those things going on?
Well, Daryl, they're all chaotic at the time. I can remember, and still to this day, people will say to me things like, "Oh, the old days, it was a lot easier." No, it wasn't. It was just that they were making money, and so they thought it was easier. It's never, well, for me, it's never been easy. There are always questions and who knows, and no matter what day, I don't know what will be happening in 3 months or 6 months. So for me, it's always been difficult. If you do well, you look back and say, those were the good old days because I did well. But it's never been easy for me. There are always questions, no matter when you are investing or living.
Hmm. So with that, the commodities bull run in the early 2000s, what commodities were mostly on your radar that you focused on? I mean, because you could look at charts and you could see, I mean, agriculture, uranium, oil, gold. You could just see.
In the 90s, there weren't many commodities. Commodities were in the doldrums, were dead. That's happened throughout history. There have been long periods when commodities have been hot and long periods when commodities have been cold, like most things, bonds or stocks or whatever. But by the end of the 80s, as I had been driving around the world, I could see the rise of Asia, and I could see that not much money had been invested in commodities. And so I assumed it was time for a new commodity bull market. And that's when I got right. It did come. But I could see, driving around the world, I could see that many economies in the world were starting to emerge, and there were gigantic numbers of people out there. And I could see that nobody had been investing in commodity production. So it seemed to me we had to have a bull market again.
Mm-mm. What did you use for like researching like supply demand, to kind of build your investment thesis, leading into that time?
Remember in the 90s, the Wall Street Journal had a commodity page, which few people knew was there. And I remember telling an old guy once that I read the commodity page every day. And he, being an old guy, a successful investor, was extremely impressed because he didn't know anybody who read the commodity page except this kid who didn't know anything. No, it was not a popular or well-known area in those days. But that's been true throughout history. There come times when everybody wants to invest in commodities, and then there are times when nobody cares, nobody knows.
Yeah, definitely. How did you navigate the global financial crisis in 2008? Were you shortened during that time? Like, how did
Yes,
you?
yes. I was negative. I was pessimistic. I was short, and I was successful. It was a good time.
Hmm. And did you end up changing like any of your investment strategies? Like some people, when they saw that opportunity in like real estate or other sectors, they took advantage of that, or did you just stick to commodities? Like, how are you positioning yourself to move forward from that?
Well, I always invest in stocks, bonds, commodities, or currencies, long and short, all over the world. So hopefully I switch among the various asset classes, depending on what I think is right. I'm not a real estate investor because I like to think I can sell. I like to think I am liquid. I mean, property, you can make staggering fortunes. Many people have. But for me, I'm not much of a property investor because I like to think I'm liquid. Whether I am or not, I like to think I am.
Hmm. Okay. And what would you say the GFC, like how bad was that in your perspective?
Well, I mean, a lot of people went bankrupt. So, Lehman Brothers has been around for decades. Well, what you call it, Bear Stearns has been around for decades. There are people have been around a long, long time that disappeared. That's significant. Um, Many people lost a lot of money. They usually do in big bear markets. But that was one of the worst because the debt was so high. And Daryl, the next one's going to be really, really bad because the debt is much, much, much higher now than it was even then. Even China has debt now. There was not many people with gigantic debt then like there are now.
Hmm. And from my perspective, from just interviewing many people that were been active in the markets for a long time, um, many of you all felt like during that time that the debt was high. Like y'all didn't imagine it that the debt today would be fathomable.
The debt today compared to the debt today is unfathomable because it's so high. Yes, the debt was high then, but nothing like it is now. I mean, everybody in the world, including China, has run up huge debt since 2009. Everybody. So, well, maybe not North Korea because nobody will lend money to North Korea, but no, everybody has run up huge debt in the last several years. So the next time we have a problem, it's got to be very bad.
Hmm. Yeah, agreed. So then we get to now we're in the current era, post pandemic. We have we've had Russia, Ukraine. Now we got Israel, Hamas. We had a banking crisis. It seems like dominoes keep falling. So what are you doing now to position yourself, or what are you looking at like now in terms of protecting your
Well,
wealth?
right
Or
now, I don't have any investments, neither long nor short, because I think that the market is having its last phase of going up. It's been going up for the longest in American history. So I am sitting and watching, uh, partly because I'm lazy, but also partly because I won't hope I get the opportunities. But if it works the way I think, there'll be a time when it will be a great period to sell short again. And I hope I'm smart enough to sell short. Mainly US tech stocks. That's where the biggest bubbles have been. But at the moment, I'm sitting around in a lot of US dollars. It's going to be perhaps the last gasp of the US dollar. The US dollar is terribly overextended. And we, the US, are the largest debtor in the history of the world. So I would suspect that the US, part of the problem for me and everybody else is where else do you put your money? And I cannot find another currency I want to invest in. So I'm sitting in dollars in periods of turmoil. People buy dollars now, but I suspect that's coming to an end. So I'm going to, if I'm right, there'll be a time to sell US dollars, and I don't know what to do with the money then. And maybe start selling short, but that's not enough.
yeah, what's your take on the metals right now, precious metals?
Well, I own some of each of them, but I'm not buying at the moment because I think there's going to be a better chance. I'm not very good at market timing, Daryl, so don't ask me. But I plan to buy more gold and silver and others as time goes on. But at the moment, I'm doing nothing.
Okay, gotcha. So if there's three character traits or characteristics about yourself and in your life, I mean, we've been talking about the life of Jim Rogers. Obviously, I'm sure there's a lot more facets to this. I mean, you have kids, your father, and so I'm sure it's a lot more facets. But if there's three character traits or things that you feel um, really helped you get to the place that you are today, what would those three be?
Well, I guess the ability to work very hard. look back on my life, and usually people around me thought I worked harder than anybody else, or was I was a very, very hard worker, whether it was in school or anything, Wall Street life, willing to put myself into it. But going around the world, you really better focus and concentrate. So the ability to concentrate and focus is very important. And the ability to work hard is part of that, obviously. Curiosity. I'm all constantly asking questions about everything in life. And I'm trying to teach my children to ask questions about everything and not to accept the conventional wisdom.
Mm-hmm. So curiosity, obviously focus, laser focus, and hard work. So
Those are three. Those aren't bad. Sounds good.
Yeah,
I like.
definitely. Well, Jim, I appreciate you for coming on. Anything you want to share with the audience? I mean, just in light of your story and someone who may be trying to figure out, what life looks like for them and how they want to pursue their dreams.
The main thing I have learned, Darrell, is that people, young, old, everybody, if they can, they should figure out what they love the most, what their passion is, and that's what they should pursue more than anything else. And if other people laugh at them, you're doing the right thing. So it's often hard to figure out what your real passion is. I said, I didn't know that my passion was when I was 21 years old. I learned by accident, but people should try to figure out what they really, really, really love the most and pursue it to the exclusion of most other things. And then they'll likely be more successful. But even if they're not successful, they don't care because they're happy. That's good enough. If you're happy, it's normally good enough.
Yeah, and someone being happy may mean success for them, and so success can come in many different forms. So thank you, Jim, for coming on. Appreciate you sharing your story with the audience. I'm honored to even have you on this episode and to hear about your grind to greatness.
It's my pleasure, Darrell, and I hope everybody finds their own grind to greatness, or at least happiness.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Darrell. Let's do it again sometime.
Yes, indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.